So, yeah, uh, yeah. For a while there, I tried to convince her to come back once in a while, but she didn't want to make the trip. So, we got a couple guys sitting way out there.
I told the kids if they come in later, they might be able to get a treat. So
Okay,
they're really excited about you.
that guy, he's watching me.
Come in. I think we might get started if you're
Okay.
ready to go. I'm gonna come up here and give a little address
sure.
to the camera. Just think we're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you guys for coming out tonight on this snowy night. Come on, find a seat, guys. So I'm Maida Hess. I am the Adult Services Librarian here. Thank you for coming out tonight. I hope you guys will learn a lot about maple syrup. If you wanted to watch this program again, it will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel, which you can find from our website. But I'm going to go ahead and let Tim take it away, and we'll learn more about maple syrup. Thank you.
Well, guys, thanks for coming out here tonight on the potential for the snow that we have, and maybe we'll all get snowed in and we'll survive on samples of maple products tonight.
It's the best place to be snowed in.
They'll tell tales of it for years to come, how we survived here. My name is Tim, and I'm the Maple Dude out west of Marshfield, about 15 miles. I have a shop out there, and that's where I grew up, on a small dairy farm. And so, like a lot of people, I think in the central Wisconsin area, especially growing up on farms and stuff, maple syrup's kind of a traditional thing that the family participates in and does. And that's kind of how I got exposed to it, was the fact that my dad taught me how to do it. And it was on a very small, primitive level at that time. And actually here in the picture below, this is my grandpa, and you can kind of see what he was boiling on back there, and I can remember that's what I grew up around, and how I learned it was just kind of like a little pan right out in the woods, right out in the open. And then that's was my introduction to it, so to speak. Up here's a picture of my kids holding me up, and they're back there, Haley and Jack in the back row. They're not too embarrassed right now, but over here, this is a Maple Fall Fest in Marshfield. We usually we've always done a booth there and set up our products and sell those. But the reason that I'm here tonight is kind of talk a little bit more about maple syrup production and maybe a little bit of the background of it in Wisconsin, and then talk about the hobby, or how a person might the things they need if they wanted to get started in doing that. So we'll kind of get right into that, because I know this slideshow has quite a bit of material in it, but we don't need to go over everything in detail. But back initially, the first people that probably discovered it were Native Americans, and in Wisconsin, these are some pictures. It looks like we've got some people boiling in some pots and stuff like that. They used it as a sugar. That was what, it was a form of sugar for them. I actually read one time that one of the ways that they boiled the sap down was they would heat up rocks in the fire and put it into the sap itself and boil it down. So that's kind of interesting. Yeah.
I went to the Point Basie over by Nakusa last year. They have a maple harvest time, and they actually had a huge hollowed out log.
Okay.
And they put the sap in there, and they did just what you said. They heated up the rocks and threw the rocks in that sap, and they just kept replacing the hot rocks until it became.
That would have to
a
be
lot of work.
A long
But
process.
Originally, the Indians
Sure.
and then the early settlers did that as well.
Right. And if you guys ever want to jump in with questions or say anything at any time, go ahead and do that.
You just said it was okay for me to
No, it was no. I'm glad you did. I was gonna say earlier that I welcome that you guys do that. And then after that, the early Europeans coming into the area, they also, were introduced to that by the Native Americans. And like I said, it became a source of energy during long portages and, journeys and stuff like that. And it says here that Thomas Jefferson started a maple grove on his Virginia plantation. That's kind of interesting because when I started learning where maples, primarily we'll show a map later where it's made in North America, but there are, believe it or not, some kind of oddball sugar bushes and maple operations in states like Virginia and Tennessee and Kentucky. Not that much. It's not that common. It's not like they produce a lot, but it does occur. And you don't normally think of it in that part of the country. Early settlers, again, that was a source of energy for them. And I will say that, how did they use it? It was cooked all the way to solid sugar. Okay, so they didn't have a way of preserving the maple syrup, I guess. So maple sugar is made by taking maple syrup and just boiling it down more until it's completely all the water's removed. And that would keep it, like with the sugar in that bag over there, it's dry. So that has a long shelf life. Bottles, they have a long shelf life. If you open them, you have to refrigerate them, but obviously they didn't have refrigeration at that time. And getting back to, actually, I'm going to go back to that one. The 1840 early settlers. On my logo and stuff like that, it says since 1858, so it's kind of around that time. That was when my family from Germany got to the town of Lynn, right over where my shop is right now. So that's how I came up with since 1858. They've been right over there in that area ever since that time. Let's get over here. So the maple tree itself, it's called the Acer saccharum. I think I'm saying that right. I've always known that for years. I just don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. It can develop 20 gallons of sap in a year, in a season. So and they've always said that if a good solid season, you would get about a quart of syrup per tap that you put on a tree. Yeah. And Jack over back there, my son, is telling me to tell you the hint of tapping a tree. I think we might get into that later, but essentially it's the hugging the tree method. So what we still do is we still do this when we do our own, is if you go up to the tree and you put your arms, you're right up against it, you put your arms around it. If you can touch your hands, we only put one tap on it. But if you can't, we'll do two. So that's kind of an old way to do that. Now, I don't know if a guy's got really long arms or short arms, that kind of probably throws that all off.
So we shouldn't worry about the other tree.
Yeah. If you see me out there, that's all I'm doing. I'm really, you might look like I'm really lonely, but I'm just hugging trees. So, all right. So we got the maple tree varieties used for maple syrup production. The sugar or the hard maple is probably the gold standard. That's the best tree that you want to tap. And those are really abundant in Wisconsin. They have the highest sugar percent or sugar content in their sap. Typically that's, I see it in our area, probably when we test it, really not uncommon to be 3% plus. Kind of the old rule of thumb is, sap is 2% sugar, but we see 3% quite a bit in this area. And I think that might be a Wisconsin thing, because in other states that produce a lot of maple syrup, like Vermont and whatnot, I see stuff online and talk to people from those areas and whatnot, and they don't normally see that high of a sugar content. So maybe in Wisconsin here, we're a little bit, lucky, or something's going on that we're getting that sugar out higher. I don't know what we're doing. But we got the red maple. That is called, or the soft maple is what maybe people call it. You might see a lot of, or the silver maple too is similar to the red soft maple. Probably see a lot of these. I know there's a lot in Marshfield, like in people's yards and stuff like that. I know I have a few. They'll have, and they're out in the woods too, and we tap them too. They just have a little bit lower sugar content, and they can give a lot of sap, but usually they're the first ones to stop running in the spring. They'll slow down and quit first before the hard maples do. So we'll go over here. Now, if you're is everybody here, have you guys made maple syrup before? No. And they're from Australia originally. And you're working at the Humane Society for Clark County. Yeah. So has anyone else here ever done maple syrup? You guys have, of course. No. So the kind of part of the program here was to give an introduction to it for if you wanted to get into it yourself and the things you need. So obviously one of the things you want to do is be able to identify a tree. Probably the best way for a beginner to do it would probably be by the leaves. That's, you can't always in the wintertime, you're not going to be able to do that. So maybe a thing to do would be to get familiar with it in the summertime, and see, what trees you have and stuff like that. And if they're in your yard, that's not going to be that hard to do. For myself, over the years, I can look at the bark now and just look at, okay, that's a maple tree, that's a maple tree. And it's just something that I visually identify now. But over the years, I was able to kind of acquire that skill, I guess you might say. This map shows where maple syrup production is in North America. It's going to be in the northeast to the, kind of the upper Midwest there. And believe it or not, Canada, I think that might be on the next slide. Hold on. And we'll go back. But Canada up here in Quebec makes like 80% of the production in the world. Wow. As compared to everything else on there. So, but I guess I've heard that like states like upstate and in the United States, Vermont is number one, but up here in upstate New York, they have a lot of potential. And I've also heard that like Wisconsin has so much untapped resource that it could probably rival what Quebec does if it was ever utilized in that way. So, whoops, let's see here. So what are the steps to produce maple syrup? Obviously, the first thing is tapping. That's a picture of me out in the woods. There's a lot of different methods and ways of collecting sap. Right there, that's kind of some tools and things that I use to put up tubing. But we would, what are the tapping guidelines? So if you've identified your trees, you have to drill a hole in the tree. And you can do, obviously, probably most people have some type of a drill or something at home. And this is actually, they make special bits for drilling holes into trees. This is actually a tapping bit, a maple tapping bit. And it's got just a little bit sharper edge on these flutes, and it will take the chips right out of the tree hole better than like what a regular bit just that you get from a hardware store. So if you're doing a lot of these, you would want this. If you're only doing a few, you probably wouldn't have to spend the money on it. These are about $20, but they're good for about like 1,000 drills into a tree, I guess, is what I'm told. And then guys will replace them. The south and the east sides run best in the early season because they're getting sun exposure. Later on in the season, they'll be the first to stop and close up because of bacterial growth. You can drill 8-inch or larger trees. I've seen different guidelines on that. I've seen people say you should only do 10 inches as a minimum, 12 inches as a minimum. It kind of varies. Right.
How big is that?
Well, that's probably about,
15.
16 or something like that. So under that, you should only do one though anyway. So like 8 to 16 inches. And then here I kind of get into what I talked about earlier of how many taps to put in a tree. You should definitely rotate the tapping on the tree. You don't want to tap next to the hole that you saw. Like if you're doing this year, you don't want to be right there next year, because there's going to be what's called a stain there under the bark and in that first layer of wood, where that will not be productive until it gets new wood growing over it. So you want to get this. Look at this tree. This looks like this has been tapped a lot. You can see all kinds of holes over. And there's some trees in our original woods, like that one picture with my grandpa on there, that have been tapped for decades and decades and decades. And, it doesn't harm the tree as long as you're, use the guidelines and it's not going to kill or do anything to the tree. We only take a very small percentage of the sap that is available.
How high up do you normally put the tap? If it gets all scarred in a certain area.
Yeah. No, that's a good question. How high up do you put the tap on the tree? For a person doing it on a hobby level, I would put it, it was kind of like where you could get to it easily and grab the pail or whatever. In person putting up these tubing systems, and I'll get into some pictures of that a little bit later. Tubing needs to flow like gravity, because it's all like tributaries of a stream with all these tubes and stuff, and to go to a collection tank somewhere. That has to have like a grade to it. It has to be able to flow. So in flatter areas, I've seen guys will get ladders out in the woods and they'll tap really high so they can build a grade or a flow downhill to the main lines that take the sap to another location. So with vacuum, which we use, we have vacuum pumps hooked up to the tubing system. Theoretically, you could probably you could take this and tap below, like if this has all been tapped a lot, you could go down and it would suck the sap up back into the tube that goes to the collection area. So spouts or spiles, I brought some along here that would be good for like hobby level production. You could do stuff like, these are a little bit different than what they show here, but this is the same concept. This is a plastic one, and it's just it's got a little hook on there for hanging a pail. It's a 5/16 hole. It's 5/16 drill bit. They used to do, was popular, was the 7/16. That's a lot bigger hole, and that took more time to heal and close up. So the move was over to the 5/16 because it's a little bit healthier for the tree and the tree heals quicker. And there really isn't any change in the production level with it. And also, like, this is another one that would be a stainless steel spout. Something like this, you're probably going to want to, you could probably boil it and clean it up. One thing that happens with spouts is they will, because there's sugar in the sap, bacteria will grow. And believe it or not, like, plastic is microscopic porous. So if it gets bacteria in it, if you use that tap the next year, you're putting last year's bacteria into a new hole, and it will actually, studies have shown it, cause that new hole to start healing more prematurely, and it'll shorten up your length of running in the season. So guys like myself, we use these on the end of the tubing. Every year we use a brand new one. We use a new spout every single season. So we cut the other one off and put it on the new one on the tube and keep going. So let's see here, where are we at? What is the sap, and what causes it to run? The sap is basically almost all water. It's like 98 to roughly 97% water most of the time. There's minerals in it, there's the sugar, but what we want to do is concentrate that down to the maple syrup. So, but if you taste sap coming out of the tree, you can taste the sweetness in it just a little bit, It's like a very faint taste of sugar there. Yeah. So leaves, this is where does it come from? Why sap flows. Basically, the tree is using photosynthesis to create food for itself and for the growth of the tree. But when will the sap run? Is you always hear people say freezing nights and warm days, and that's true. What happens is when the cold when it freezes at night, this causes a suction of the roots, the sap, the water. It's sucking the water up and through the tree, and then when the water is going up through the roots, and then the fibrous, the wood in the tree, it's picking up those carbohydrates from the photosynthesis. And then during the day, if it warms up into the 40s, you're kind of looking, those are the ideal temps, the 20s at night, 40s during the day. That creates pressure inside the tree, the warmth. And then that's where the sap wants to come. It's moving around in there. So then that if you drill the hole, it wants to come out of that hole because there's pressure in there. And now with that being said, I've also seen it like here on the bottom, low pressure system, like a rainy, snowy, kind of crappy weather day also makes the sap run. So it's kind of the opposite of what you would think. But with that, there's a lower pressure outside the tree. So it makes it easier for it to come out, that, a low pressure system instead of high. So it kind of works both ways. Traditionally, what you hear is the warm days, sunny days, and that does hold true. But a lot of times we'll get these really weird big runs when it gets rainy or snowy or something like that. And then that's what I was just talking about. Here you got the suction of the water absorption when it's freezing at night, and then the thaw during the day. The inside is under pressure, and if you drill a hole or there, even if like the tree has like a wound or something like that, I'll see that it'll come right out, like a crack or a broken branch or a twig. Let's see here, how often and when do the sap runs occur? In Wisconsin, the sap runs occur because you're getting the right conditions for that to happen in the late winter, early spring. And I would say right here in central Wisconsin, we're talking like the first week of March, 8th to 10th of March till about that time in April, 8th to 10th, mid-April. Typically, it's usually like a 4-week season. And, that's typical for us. Other more southern states, it's going to be earlier. I watch a lot of stuff online. Some of those states, like you get down into like some of those I was talking about before, like Kentucky or Tennessee, they're making syrup in July or January because it's just that much earlier than what we are here. You go up into, even from here where we're in central Wisconsin to like northern Wisconsin or the UP, they're probably a couple weeks behind what we are from when they would start. And it says a good year is at least 3 major sap runs. I would say that's pretty accurate. That means when you're going to get, the sap will run, you'll have days where it's just not running much, you just get a little bit, but then you'll have probably 3 or so what they call major runs where the conditions are just right and the trees just really want to run, and you can get inundated with sap, like overwhelmed. I mean, it can get kind of crazy on how much they can run during periods like that. So collecting the sap, the bags, the buckets. This is actually a picture of me. Way back in the day, probably out in that same spot where my grandpa's picture was. So, but you can see we were just doing pails. That one looks like a rusty old pail right there. Yeah. But I remember using like those buckets, and like even out in the woods, you can still find these old pails laying out there. But you know, changes in the industry. The buckets, you know, the size of the bucket, 3 to 4 gallons. Not uncommon to see like on a big run that it would overfill that, and that's just the dripping. That's not using vacuum. So, but like the changes in the industry for bigger producers, it's moving to plastic pails and sap sacks like this. And I was gonna talk. So the bags, yeah. This is like if you're doing a hobby and you want to get into it a little bit, you have some trees on your property. I talked about the spouts here. And this is talking about the bags. This is what I would probably recommend using, would be something like this. I like it a lot better than the pails. They've got a little bit different top on there, but this is a metal bag holder it's called. And this is just a blue plastic bag that they do make for maple sap use. And you get them, and all it is you just put this in here like this. See if I can do this real slick. You fold it over this ring and put this in here. And then once it's together like that, you know, it's not going to come off there. And then this is the spout that you would use, that stainless steel one I talked about before. It's got this little flange on there. So this end goes into the tree with that drill. Tap it, and I brought this is a special actually tapping hammer, which is made to tap spouts in. This is actually a little metal chipper on the end. It's to chip bark away if it's got like a really thick bark that's kind of hard to get to the actual surface of the tree there. But tap that in, and this just hangs on there. And then if you can see right there, sap will drip into the sack. Question. Oh, very good question. How far do you, thank you, Jack.
I'm going to scooch so people can see
Okay,
everything
okay.
too.
I was gonna say this before, I have a trick that it's 1.5 to 2 inches, and on my drill bit, I put a piece of tape at that distance, and so when I drill to that tape mark, I stop.
Yep, that's a good way to do it. Is Jack, did that answer your question?
I have another comment.
Yeah.
I use these, and
Okay.
they're wonderful. Except that when they're empty, they blow all over the place.
That is
And
true.
so a few years ago, I learned you take a bunch of little round rocks and you wash them and sterilize them.
Okay.
You put rocks in the bottom of your bags and they lay up
Really?
against the tree and don't fly off.
I've never heard of that one before, but that makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah, no, that is true. These are nice because, and like when we used to use them, if you got one of those big runs, it would literally, good trees and it would fill this. And then you'd come and it'd be dripping out the sides. But what you do is you lift it off of there, and then you take it like this and you just pour it out into a pail. So, and you know, transport it to where you want to go. But it's nice because you can just get rid of this. You don't have to wash the buckets later, stuff like that. But yeah, you drill about 1.5 to 2 inches deep, and which is in that range. And you can put like a piece of tape or electrical tape wrapped around there, and then you know how far to go in. Let's see here. SAP tubing systems. What is the tubing? I talked a little bit about that. So like I was talking about, here's what is called a main line. That's a bigger tube, probably like 1 inch in diameter or maybe larger. And then these are plastic tubes, lines that they go, it's kind of like tributaries to a stream. These go out and go to the trees in the woods, and you put like about 5 taps on each one of these. So it's going to go out and hit 5 trees roughly. And then the sap will flow down into this bigger one. and go to the endpoint. Like right here is a close-up picture of what a spout might look like with a tubing system. With the vacuum, like what we do with this is we have this under vacuum, so it's literally sucking. So that's kind of where you can play. It kind of manipulates the conditions that you're waiting for naturally, like the freezing and the thawing cycles and the pressure difference. This is kind of creating that low pressure outside artificially all the time. So it's pulling the sap out. And another thing that's kind of interesting about that is vacuum versus this method, you literally are talking about double the yield versus the dripping. So you get at least twice as much doing that. That's actually me out there. Well, this was a system we put up this winter, and we actually just, aside from tapping the trees part of it, which we haven't done yet, we just finished it today, actually. We put up a new one of those systems out in the woods this winter. How much sap to make maple syrup? So, over the course of the season, over the course of the season, like 10 to 12 gallons of sap per bucket or sap sack, and that's where I said you can usually figure on making about 1 quart of maple syrup out of a tap with a vacuum, double that, just like I was talking about. One way to figure about how much sap it will take to make a gallon of syrup is the rule of 86. It's pretty simple. It's just take 86 and divide it by your sugar content in the sap. And so if its sugar content is 2, it's going to take 43 gallons of the sap to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. Obviously, if you go up to 3, that's roughly, what is that, like 29 or something like that. So going from 2 to 3 creates quite a bit of difference in how much sap you can, or how much syrup you can make. Like we saw that last year, the sugar content of the sap was a lot higher for us than it was the previous year. But the gallons we brought in of sap wasn't that much different. We made a lot more syrup just because of the sugar content was a little bit higher. So you do that with, well, this isn't exactly what it is, but they make an instrument. This is called a hydrometer, which I can talk about that very shortly here, but this is a syrup hydrometer to test your syrup when it's done. They make one of these for sap too. And you would just pour your sap in here in something like this, and you put the hydrometer, this is actually in a plastic case, but I'll show you what it looks like. You don't want to drop these because they're really flat, really fragile. They have ones calibrated for sap, but then you would just float this in there, and it's got, graduation or the numbers on there that show the sap sugar content, and it's all, calibrated out. So it'll float in there showing where you're at with your sugar content, whether it be 2, 3, or whatever it might be.
Or you can wait until you're all done and do the math.
You could do that. Let's see here. What is the process of making maple syrup? What is an evaporator? Okay. Conversion of sap to syrup. Traditionally, it's essentially a boiling process. I mean, that's really all it is you're taking water out of the sap. You're boiling it away, and you're trying to get the sugar in there concentrated to the correct density for maple syrup. So, but the boiling itself gives it some of that flavor and that caramelization that's going on while it's boiling. Here's what you would maybe be looking for to do if you wanted to do it on your own on a small scale if you've never done it before. They do make little tiny, like I sell supplies and materials and equipment to make stuff at my store, and I actually sell this company's product. This is a tiny little evaporator. It's got like a little wood stove under it. You throw the wood in there, and it's got a little pan on, and you boil it. It got a little valve that you can let it out, but probably for somebody just doing a few in their yard or something like that, a good way to start would be to have some type of a stainless steel pot and have it sit in on like a propane burner, and just, so you can be outside and just boiling it. You're checking it and trying to get that syrup or that sugar content up in it to get to the correct bricks for maple syrup. I've heard of people doing it on their stove in their kitchen, but I think that can get kind of pretty humid in there, and I wouldn't probably recommend that if you are thinking about doing that. This is a picture of inside our shop. This is what we have to boil down. It's an evaporator. It's 3.5 feet wide by 14 feet long. The pan's on it, and it's actually natural gas powered. So we're burning natural gas in there instead of wood. We used to do wood in the same building, but I upgraded to that like in 2019. So I wouldn't want to go back to doing wood myself because it's so much work, cutting the wood, splitting the wood, bringing it in, putting it in. Now I just turn on a switch and there it goes. That's it. And it's changed that a lot. Yeah.
Just a question, do you notice the difference in the flavor of your syrup?
I have not.
You're pretty closed in though.
Yeah. Are you talking more about, so the question was, have you seen a difference in the flavor of the syrup versus wood-fired versus gas-fired? I haven't. My dad was one that would have said he thought maybe something like that would have happened. He says he hasn't. So, I mean, I think everybody pretty much is pretty satisfied with it. But I will get into something that maybe you're kind of hits on what you're talking about in just a minute. Yes, sir.
It's kind of light though, but if you were gonna have 82 divided by 3 for the gallons, it would roughly be 27 or 26.
Is it 20? Okay, for the.
27 if you would round up.
Okay, yeah.
So 27 gallons for 1 gallon of syrup.
That's a huge difference from 43. From 2 to, isn't it? I mean, that makes a huge difference over the course of a season. He got that right out of here. Yes.
How long does it take to boil it down?
Well, okay. So basically, yeah, let's go back to this picture. Something like this, probably you're only going to be boiling, I want to say maybe like, 3 or 4 gallons per hour of sap evaporated. That's not getting 3 or 4 gallons of syrup per hour. You're boiling off 3 or 4 gallons of sap probably an hour. So if you had to boil off 40 to get 1 gallon, I mean, it's time consuming. There's no doubt about it. It's going to take you like 10 hours to get 1 gallon doing this. It's a lot. Little thing like this is probably going to be a little bit better. Maybe like,
Still takes 8 hours.
yeah, 7 or 8 gallons per hour, something like that. It's definitely what we're doing here, coupled with the reverse osmosis that we use, which I think I'm going to talk about that next. This alone itself will boil off around 210 gallons of sap an hour. So with the reverse osmosis that we use to concentrate the sap, we're roughly it can make about 50 gallons of syrup in an hour. 50. So like fill like a 55 gallon drum. You can fill one of those in like an hour roughly. So the reverse osmosis system, which is a method to remove water from the sap to make that whole process that we just talked about, that is very, very long, much, much shorter. So we use reverse osmosis. This kind of shows a little bit of the components of it here. That's in the shop. It will take we're taking over 80% of the water out of the sap before we even boil it. So it's highly concentrated. It's a concentrate. It's very highly concentrated in sugar. And then we boil that. And that if we didn't do that, there's no way we could process what we do. That really essentially really does most of the work. is the reverse osmosis system is doing most of it. But then the evaporator, which I showed in the previous picture, is doing the final stage of it, basically. One thing, here's what the concern for flavor, if cooking time is too short, or some people say, does it have a different flavor? We concentrate it up to around that 20% range. There are some crazy systems out there that will concentrate it up to like in that up 40s range, which what that means, 40% means like that rule, that 86, it's essentially got halfway there. So it's like 1 out of every, like 2 gallons of that in there, you're basically just getting rid of the 1 to get the gallon of syrup. So I have heard that if you go really high like that, it doesn't quite have the maple flavor to it. It's sweet, but it doesn't really have because it's not getting cooked very long. It's not getting boiled very long. It's just kind of getting heated and it's done. So it's sweet, but might not have the traditional maple flavor that you would probably expect from like, maybe what you grew up with or your grandpa or your dad or somebody did something like that. Measuring syrup density. So here we got the hydrometer. Now, if you're a beginner, you would want one of these. You would definitely want this. This is a syrup hydrometer, and you need something to measure the syrup in. So you go back to like this guy's in this pan. He's got something to dip it out, the syrup that's boiling in the pan, and you pour it into here. And this is how you're checking your density to see if it's getting closer and closer to done. So as you're boiling it more, obviously the sugar is building up in that sap and that syrup in there. And every time it does, the more it does, it's going to make this, because this has got a weight in it, it's going to make this float higher because what's in here is thicker. And you're looking for a hot test on here that's got that red line. And you're looking to get to 66 to 67 Brix. Brix is just a term used for sugar content in the syrup. Or you can do it by a thermometer. Syrup is finished at 7 degrees above the boiling point of water. So water boils at 212 at sea level. We're not at sea level, we're higher. I find that water boils around us about 210. So typically it's around 217 degrees. So you can watch a thermometer and also do it that way. Filtering and bottling the syrup. There's me after a long day of making syrup. That was last season. I think we took a funny thing. We did all these in one day. Wow. That was a long day. That was a lot of hours there. But even with the reverse osmosis and everything, it was still a lot of hours. But that was like one of the bigger days I think we ever had. Last year, by the way, we had the biggest, and it was nationwide or industry-wide, Canada, United States, Wisconsin, even for ourselves, it was the biggest production that ever occurred. So it was a really good year. The bottling process, if you're going to do syrup on your own at home, it's very easy. You could come out to my shop. I sell bottles individually, the caps and all that stuff. Really, the one thing you want to do is make sure that you fill the bottles of the syrup at about 190 degrees, because that will sterilize the bottle and make it shelf stable. If you don't, and I've seen this many, many times with people beginning with it or whatever, they're wondering why that there's mold forming on the top of the syrup in their bottle. It's because they didn't get it hot enough when they filled it. What creates the grades? These are different grades of syrup: golden, amber, dark, very dark. Typically what this follows is just the natural course of the season. In the beginning of the season, like in early March, you're going to make, we don't ever really make this. I've never really, it might be something just in situational or our soils or whatever. One thing I do see is more like this stuff comes from like out in Vermont and the eastern states. And I've seen people make it in Wisconsin. We just don't very much. It's more typically what we make is in this range. It's a color change. The lighter colors are usually right away in the beginning. And then at the very end, the very dark is towards the very end of the season when the sap's kind of changing and you're getting near the end, and it can definitely create some stronger flavors, and that would be a good one to be used in cooking and baking and stuff like that. It gives maple its unique flavor. It's the cooking of the sugars and the time it spends in the pan makes a bit of difference. Like I said, the faster processes maybe produce a little bit more of a milder maple flavor, where the long process produces maybe a more richer, darker, robust maple flavor. So that's a little bit different. Maple syrup comparison to other sweeteners. Thought this one was maybe a little bit interesting. If you look at some of these, manganese, riboflavin, zinc, magnesium, versus obviously corn syrup's not good for you. I wouldn't recommend that I'd stay away from it if you can. I mean, it's almost in everything though. If you look, it's almost in almost everything. But honey, which is a good natural one, but if you look at that, maple syrup's kind of beating up on it a little bit there, and brown sugar, white sugar. So, and the calories are roughly about the same. So, maple syrup is a good natural sweetener if you're looking to have something sweet used as a sweetener or sugar. Maple syrup is a very good alternative for that. I was going to ask that. Did anybody see that one?
I was going to say 3.
Where does maple syrup? I was in a question I was going to ask. Where do you think Wisconsin stands as in maple syrup production in the United States? You say third? Did you see it? He saw it.
He's paying attention.
Yeah, you're quick. Wisconsin is usually almost always fourth. It's not usually. Vermont is always first. And then I think Maine and New York can switch around, flip. You wouldn't, when you think New York, you think New York City, but actually New York is very big, and upstate New York has a lot of,
That's where we were.
Yeah.
born and raised.
right,
The other New York.
right. Yeah. It's very much a rural state up there, and there's a big maple syrup production up there in New York. And then using maple syrup today, this is a picture of my bottles and stuff like that. And, it's no preservative, it's all pure. You refrigerate it after you open it. You can freeze it. It doesn't actually freeze solid. Some products that we make the maple cream. We do candy, we do the sugar. This is a product we did. It was just a little maple, we call it the maple shot. It was like a 1 ounce little tear off packet. We're going to get back into doing that. We had issues with the packaging. We sent the syrup out to a third party that would take our barrels and fill these. And long story short, it just didn't work out the last run. So we kind of had a pause in that one. And we actually bought a small machine of our own that we hope we can do it in-house at our place now. We actually just got it a few days ago, like last week, and I haven't even had a chance to look at that yet, really.
Tell us more about what the maple cream is.
Yeah, so the maple cream is a topping or a spread right here. It's essentially all these, like this is just maple syrup that we take and we boil it to, let's see, it would have been, I got to remember my numbers here. It's like 32, like the syrup is 7 degrees above the boiling point of water. We boil this to, I think, 23 degrees above the boiling point of water. And that makes it a much thicker, a much more dense mixture. And then we cool it down. I put it in that amount that I boiled, put it in a refrigerator overnight. So then it's really, really thick and cool. Then I have a machine that I put it into and it churns it. And what it does is it causes crystallization to occur. So, but because you're boiling it to that temp, it will take it and make it into this creamy like spread. It's really got a good flavor to it. But essentially that's kind of like what a lot of the maple products are, is just boiling that syrup to different points beyond what syrup is. And then different things occur with them. So some other things that we do, there's some specialty products, like we do a maple soda, which we have our maple soda. We have a third party that bottles that for us. Maple cotton candy is pretty good. We do the maple almonds. The bourbon barrel aged maple syrup is kind of a different one. We take bourbon barrels that have been oak bourbon barrels that have come from a distillery that has been emptied, and then we put syrup in it and let it age in there like a year, and then it'll give it a really unique maple bourbon flavor. So just my slogan is always remember, always keep it real. And this is a picture of me goofing around. That's my dad. And then this is my brother-in-law, John, who over the past years has helped a lot during the season. So you can follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Haley got me on TikTok back there. That one is, I think that's the end of that part of it. I went through all the slides. One thing, let me talk about this a little bit too. That didn't really come up in there too good, but we went over the basics here if you wanted to do a little home production, and we went over the bag, the spouts, the drill, how to test it with hydrometer, the basic things you need. You would want something to filter the syrup with, so after you're done boiling it, the real basic method would be to use one of these filter cones or these bags. And
I'm gonna move this so
I'm
people
not
can
sure.
kind of see. And I might have you hold up some things later.
Okay.
So you can see too.
Okay. And it's just essentially when that syrup's coming out of that pot or that pan, let it go through here. This will catch all the niter and stuff that precipitates out of it from the boiling process. These are pre-filters that you can put inside there that help a little bit. So like if you didn't do this, what would happen would be bottom of the bottle, when you filled your bottles, there would be like a layer in there that looks like sand, basically. And a lot of people at first get a little bit confused by that because they're like, well, what did I do wrong? There's a bunch of sand in the bottom of my bottle, but they probably didn't filter it, or you're getting back to where I said heat it to 190. If you go over 190 after you've filtered it, essentially you're boiling again, it will precipitate more of that out. And then they're wondering, well, I filtered it. Why did this form in my bottle? It's because they got it too hot when they were filling the bottles. And more of that stuff will come out, more of those minerals and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Mold will form if you don't refrigerate and so forth.
Right.
But that, I did a little investigation when I saw that happening, and that mold is really not horrible. You can scrape that mold off,
Yeah.
pre-boil your syrup, and eat it. It won't hurt you.
Yep.
Good to know.
Yeah. It's just kind of like a paper thin
Yeah.
sheet that forms
I
on
wouldn't
there.
eat the mold, but you can make it
Right.
Eat the syrup.
Right. Yeah. Don't eat the mold, but that's a good tip for life. Don't eat mold.
Like little bubbles on the top.
It's kind of, yeah, I mean, it's mold. It just looks like a white film
Because
on
sometimes
there.
I find my maple syrup has little like bubbles.
Oh, not the bubbles. No.
You know, and that's
But-
just- but literally it's just
Yeah.
a jar sitting there and there's like,
Yeah. No, you would know it.
oh.
It would float around and stay
Oh.
together. So, yeah.
Oh, okay. Never had that.
I just would hate to throw the syrup out.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's kind of going through that. Do you have anybody got any questions right now? Any other further questions or anything about the process or about the business or about what we do or?
What are your numbers? I mean, how much do you produce in a season?
Last year we produced just shy of 5,000 gallons of maple syrup. So that was the biggest year we've ever had. If we wouldn't have spilled a lot of sap and had some accidents along the way, we probably would have went just over 5,000, but I figure we wasted about a 55-gallon drum of maple syrup in there somehow, which, I mean, it's going to happen when you're doing that volume.
How fast, like, you had a picture of you laying in all the barrels.
Yeah.
do you have to boil, can the sap wait, or do you have to boil it right away?
I mean,
Like on your production day, are you
Yeah,
taking that sap and boiling it right away?
for the most part, when we're getting like where you're making that much in a day, you're doing it right away as soon as you can get it collected. And where my shop is, it's not right by the woods. It's like a half mile from our closest one. We're hauling it up there, and it's pretty much, when you're dealing with that volume, you're doing it right away. If it's not running very good and it's kind of slow, it's like to run our equipment, we want kind of a lot of sap there to even fire it up. If it's colder out than outside, you can let it sit around a little bit and it won't get too bad. But once we get towards later on in the season, how you can get in April, you get some days where it's even like in the 60s, we've seen that, or even 70s kind of towards the end of the season. You want to get that sap boiled very, very quickly at that point because it can spoil pretty fast. What's your question?
What's the least year you produced the least days?
Okay, that's a good question. What's the least or the worst year we had? That would be back in, I know this for a fact, it was back in 2012, so it's crazy. It's like 11 years ago now, but and I was at a much different level at that point. I wasn't even in this building. But it was a very, very, very poor year for everybody and pretty much for the whole maple industry. It was only like, I remember it was only like a 2 or 3 day season.
Yeah, it was really short.
It was done because we went out of winter and it was like 80 degrees in March, like that.
Yeah.
And it was just like over with because the trees, that's the other thing, when the trees bud, the sap will stop running. Even as they're approaching that, they'll start, and the sap will start changing and become what they call, a term is called buddy sap. And you can produce syrup with it, but it'll have like a lot of weird off flavors and stuff that you don't want to make. So, but that's when the season ends, is typically when the buds start coming out, and that's just the natural progression into spring. But that year it went from like winter to this, so I think it was in the 80s, like right away in like the middle of March. And that was at a time when I wasn't doing this as a real full-time business. I do this full-time now, so it didn't hurt me really. If it happened now, it'd be bad. I'd be out on the street or something. Just Jack. We tap ourselves about 4,300. And then we also we buy sap from guys in our area that tap their trees too. So they're tapping their trees and bringing that to us, and we're processing that. Somewhere in the round, probably together with all that, about 15,000 taps that we cook through.
So you know what your sap tastes like, but
Yeah.
you bring in sap from, the guy across the
Yeah.
street. Is his sap different?
Not really. I mean, because it all comes from these are people that I've kind of worked with for years, and they're all kind of generally within a few miles of me, 5 miles or so. We're in the kind of the same area, so it should be pretty much the same. But it is important to keep your equipment clean. We have a working relationship with them. They keep their tanks clean that they transport it in, and that is a big difference in syrup quality, is keeping your equipment clean, your tanks clean, stuff that you handle the syrup with or the sap with. So that's huge. Is cleanliness makes a big deal in the production of the syrup. Any questions back there?
Do you make sure you're cleaning your drill bits each time you go from one trip to the next trip?
I don't. I think I've heard of people that actually spray a solution on it every time they drill a hole. I don't do that though, but there's people that will do that. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So when does it expire, or when does it expire?
Maple syrup finished in a glass bottle like that. If you don't open it, it can stay shelf stable for years. I mean, honestly, 3 years. I put 3 years expiration date on it, but we've had my sister, when she got married, and this was many, many years ago, she did gifts of maple syrup as for wedding favors. And then we still have some of those unopened sitting around, and those would be like 20 years old now. And they look, they're fine. I've heard stories like that too. People will find bottles or have bottles that have never been opened way longer than that, and it's still good. It does, as long as it's was boiled correctly and packed, bottled correctly, it should stay for a very, very long time. Glass would keep better than plastic. Plastic would over time have it would have a shorter shelf life. Any other questions?
Actually, if you're really concerned, you can can it with, in regular canning jars.
Yeah,
People do that.
you can do that too. That's another method that you can use.
Can I just have you show some of your equipment there so that on the camera?
Oh, some of this stuff?
Yeah, just because for the recording, if anyone wants to watch
Yeah.
at home, I want them kind of be able to see.
Okay.
So that's,
This is the sap bag that we had talked about earlier. That's a good beginner method, or there's some people that put out thousands of these still. But that's a good way to start out. And these are different spouts. Like this is a plastic bucket hanging spout if you want to use a pail. These are the stainless steel taps that work well with that bag. This is a tapping hammer, but you wouldn't have to have a tapping hammer if you weren't doing that many. You could use a regular hammer. But this,
Tapping hammer is good because it makes a different sound.
yeah.
makes a satisfying sound.
Well, if it's like.
Yeah, that is true. What Jack's talking about there is, you don't want to hit it like it's a nail and just drive it home like you're a carpenter or something like that. Because what that'll lead to is actually splitting the bark or splitting the tree at the bark, and you get sap leaking out there instead of coming out the end of the hole. So you tap it, and Jack's talking about this. You tap, 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 and it'll change sound. That's when to quit. It'll be like tick, tick, boom. It'll kind of make a different sound on the last one. And you don't want to go past that because then it's like like I said, you're kind of pounding it in too far or too hard. This is a hydrometer cup, so that's just meant for putting your syrup or your sap in. And then this is a hydrometer, and that is an instrument used to measure the density of the syrup when you're boiling it. And it'll give you the correct reading when it's hot. Drill and drill bit. 5/16 drill bit is what is normally used now. Yeah, smaller diameter. So.
Any other questions? Okay, I'm gonna end this broadcast and then we can move on to the fun stuff.
Okay, sure.